Hello, it is that time of year again, and if you've been with the channel for a while, you'll know that one of my favourite festive traditions is the haunted tale. So, grab your mead, light those fires, and put a tarp over all your mirrors. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and here is my Warhammer ghost story for Christmas, the Ochre Paddle. Off the old forest road, there's a trail that leads to a very ancient bridge over a very deep river. Cross it and walk long enough through the twisted woods beyond, and you'll come to the ruins of a mighty fortress. This place was once a wonder of early empire. On a precipitous cliff face stood an imposing keep, topped by a single staggeringly tall tower that protruded at an unusual angle, almost seeming to dangle over the cliff edge below as it reached its highest point. At the base, the keep was surrounded by a nigh impenetrable wall from the cliff edge on one side to the edge on the other, the sheer drop providing a natural defence to the rear. The wall was constructed of cane stone, transported at great expense from quarries near Paravon, the durability of the material being surpassed only by the status it implied. The solidity of the castle's construction and the solemnity of the guards on its walls first suggested that this was a dour and serious place, a functional outpost content to stand resolute and unmoved until the end times. But to look a little closer was to give lie to this huge stone truth. The architects of the fortress had spared no expense, not just on materials, but on decoration as well. So ostentatious and brash was the castle that its authority in war was almost entirely undermined. There was a considerable indulgence in extravagant carvings and ornament wherever there was space. Every nook, cranny, and flat surface was home to intricate details, complex shapes and sigils, or the gaping maw of grotesques and enormous gargoyles. And yet, for all the fripperies and follies of its design, it really was an impressive castle after all. It stubbornly held out against countless sieges and attacks at the hands of green-skinned tribes and bestial warbands over many decades, and as such, it had kept safe the family that called it, and the lands around it, home. This fortress was the seat of power and culture for a great baronry of the northern lands, the last of whom was called Baron Loritz Meidner. Like his fortress, Meidner was a man of contradictions in both aspect and character. He was short, highly athletic, and with a glorious mane of beautiful blonde hair that he took a great deal of care to keep healthy and clean. He was not a handsome man, but many who looked upon him found his visage memorable and impressive in some indescribable way. Perhaps it was the clarity and intensity of his ice-blue eyes, and the way in which he would stare deep into the eyes of those to whom he was addressing. It was said that to look too long into his penetrating gaze would bring bad luck, but that may have just been a way for folk to excuse looking away as quickly as possible, rather than suffer further ocular discomfiture. Under Meidner's rule, his people had prospered, and so he was thought of fondly by many, but few understood that this prosperity really had very little to do with the Baron. He had simply benefited from the wise decisions of his ancestors, and the good fortune of successive bountiful seasons. Truth be told, Meidner was rarely interested in the affairs of his people or his court. Instead, he held only two twin passions that consumed him utterly: his wealth and himself. Just as the exterior of Meidner's fortress was covered in carvings wherever there was space, the interior walls played host to innumerable mirrors and looking glasses, leaving no patch of stone unadulterated. This was no doubt in service of Meidner's extreme vanity. He liked nothing more than to admire himself at all times and in all contexts. Whether presiding over court, eating a feast, matching wits with his favourite subjects at the gaming table, wherever he was, Meidner would always spare a glance to review his reflection in action, and to ensure that his hair looked as glorious as always. Most of his followers had long since learned to ignore these moments of distraction, holding off on their next move, or waiting to pour another drink until the Baron's attention returned to the real world before him. As the solstice approached and the weather had turned, ice-cold winds had struck the Baron's land with uncommon ferocity. It was the coldest Mondstadt in a generation, and some said that the boundaries of the frozen northern wastes were stretching deeper into the lands of men than ever before. Food became scarce as the early frost killed crops, and much of the peasantry was struggling to stay fed and warm. It was proving especially difficult for most families to keep the Tal log lit for the duration of Monstil, a necessary tradition if you were to ensure a prosperous year ahead. To let the log go cold was to disrespect the god of nature and the forests, and that was sure to bring ill fortune. Baron Maedner paid these struggles no mind. Instead, he simply ordered that all of the fires in the fortress burn continuously, so that he might avoid feeling the cold at all. Day and night they were tended, burning through an enormous quantity of fuel, with little heed paid to the rites and rituals owed to Tal. Rather than stand the cost for this extravagance himself, the Baron had raised the taxes on his people, putting most pressure on the merchants and traders who worked across his lands. If they could not pay the sudden, exorbitant levies, then they were simply arrested and imprisoned in the fortress dungeons, their wares confiscated, and most likely burned in place of the fuel that the tax might have bought. Several days after these new fees were enacted, the Baron's court was interrupted by the arrival of a prisoner, a travelling merchant who lacked the funds to pay what she now owed, and so was about to be hauled away to the dark dungeons. But a curious object had been discovered in her carriage. A great oak chest made of blackened wood, sturdy and well crafted, was found alongside the typical merchant fare of poorly maintained weaponry, pots, pans, and simple tools. The chest was secured by means of a single lock, the key for which the merchant claimed never to have possessed. In fact, they would have the tax collectors believe that they had never even seen the contents of the chest. This lack of cooperation would simply have ensured even worse treatment in the dungeons, but it was the livery of the chest that meant the merchant must face the Baron immediately. On its lid, a profane symbol had been burned deep into the wood, and though its meaning was unknown to the collectors, they were certain that the Baron must see it before judgment was passed. And so, on an icy morning, the heated discussion of subsidized grain provisions for essential farm workers was broken by the intrusion of tax collectors, merchant, and chest. Baron Maedner was not a bloodthirsty man, but he understood the need for harsh punishments, else the populace forget their place and take dangerous liberties like worshipping dark gods or stealing bread to feed their starving families. The symbol on the chest was as unknown to him as it was to his enforcers, but to look upon it gave a most curious sensation. At first, it seemed to be a crude billhook, but a central sphere obscured the shape too much for this to be the intended image, and the handle of the implement seemed less like a grip and more like a writhing flame. Even after several long minutes of contemplation, the meaning of these shapes before his eyes eluded the Baron, but he was certain of its wrongness. The merchant was asked again to provide a key to the chest, or to explain its contents, but once again, they claimed never to have opened it, and so, without need for any more ado, they were sentenced to immediate execution for their pursuit of ruinous power. The merchant was led away screaming, and 2 guards hoisted the heavy chest into the air to carry it away. It would be assaulted with axes until all that remained was kindling for the fires. As the guards inched their way out of the hall, the discussion regarding grain started up again, and the Baron found himself looking longingly after the momentary distraction as it was ferried away. Just then, one of the guards lost their grip, and the chest was dropped to the floor, one corner taking the full impact onto flagstone, and completely shattering as a result. The walls of the chest burst open as if it were made of paper, and the enwrapped contents within scattered across the floor of the court. As if his prayers had been answered, Maedner seized on this unexpected diversion and proposed a game. At the feet of the many members of the court were just as many objects, each bound in thin leather wrapping to obfuscate its contents. The Baron proposed that each courtier would take a turn in selecting one of the items from the floor, unwrapping it, and choosing whether to keep it or to toss it into the fire blazing away in the hearth. As he was the Baron, he would of course get to go more than once, and during the excitement that followed, Maedner would take as many as 5 turns. Luckily, there were exactly enough objects for every member of the assembled court to still make a claim. Most of the objects seemed curious in the extreme. Small bundles of twigs, rocks carved with unknown sigils, an assortment of orc teeth, an ivory rattle instrument of some description, and even a set of dried and dusty finger bones from an inhumanly long hand. Unsurprisingly, many of these objects were flung into the fire along with their wrapping, but a few courtiers were inclined to retain the curios they'd found. Maedner himself chose to keep 2 of the items he had been gifted by the former merchant. The first was a manuscript bound with expensive ribbon. Written in Old Tylean with exquisite penmanship, the title page of the text proclaimed that it was the work of proscribed political philosopher Machiavelli Vendetto. Allegedly, this was his final and most insightful text, a mirror for princes that offered the reader invaluable guidance for accumulating political power. The printer's mark bore a striking resemblance to the charred brand on the now wrecked chest. Although the Tyleans claimed to be master statesmen, it was curious to think that the nation of warring states rarely, if ever, aligned under a single ruler, so Maedna was doubtful that even the most incisive treaty could actually offer real keys to power. But he was not one to look into the mouth of a horse gifted freely, so he would keep the text to review when the feeling took him. The other piece he kept was a small, handheld paddle looking glass. It was simple in its manufacture, a single piece of stained wood with an oval head and protruding handle. On one face was a mirrored surface, perfect for admiring one's own beauty. On the other side was nothing but the same pyrogravure sigil as on both the printed text and the chest, likewise burned into the wood. What was different, though, was that the wood of the entire paddle had been treated so as to give it a golden ochre tone. Though the grain was still visible through the staining, there was a miraculous quality that sometimes caught the light, giving the wooden surface the appearance of a polished lacquer from Nippon, or a burnished metal. As Maedna admired himself in the glass, he was startled by the sudden appearance somewhere behind him of an unknown knight. Fully armoured from head to toe in bright yellow plate, it would have been impossible for this foreign agent to have snuck into the court without being heard or seen. But there, over Maedna's shoulder in the far corner of the room, stood the menacing figure, hooded cloak overhead and sword drawn at its side. In that shocking moment of sight, Maedna started and dropped the paddle mirror, turning on the spot and calling for his guards to seize the intruder. To the members of the Baron's entourage, this sequence of events was inexplicable. Seemingly without reason, their leader screamed aloud and demanded that guards arrest an invisible enemy. The corner to which he pointed was devoid of life. There was no yellow knight anywhere to be seen in the hall. After a panicked search about the room, the guards stood dumbfounded, looking to their Baron for further instruction, lest they have to arrest a pillar or chair for being in the wrong place. It did not take long for Maedna to collect himself and realize that his courtiers were alarmed at his unusual outburst. Rather than commit to what must have been a fleeting confusion, he blamed a trick of the light and dismissed the assembly. He would take the time to relax in a warming bath rather than test his nerves further with the mind-numbing aggravations of politics or the flickers of phantoms in the faded winter light. Before taking his leave of the remaining officials, Maedna felt compelled to reclaim the paddle from the floor where he had dropped it. Miraculously, the glass remained intact, though there was a spot of rust that he hadn't noticed before. No matter, he thought. This was a mere keepsake to add to his collection. It need not be in perfect condition. And what a collection it was. There must be over 1,000 mirrors hung on the walls of the fortress, though the most impressive of Maedna's looking glassware was reserved only for his own reflection. Maedna's chambers were, if imagination can allow it, even more extravagant than the rest of his family home. In his bedchamber stood a huge 4-post bed, flanked by 2 enormous fireplaces. Each was kept burning at all times, Maedna having made clear that they were the most important in the entire fortress. He would be damned rather than be cold in the night. Of the many other studies, libraries, and bedrooms in his private quarters, much could be written, not least regarding the many treasures and artifacts that the Maedna barons had confiscated from their rightful owners over the generations. But it was the bathing room that Maedna had retired to after his long day in court. Connected to Maedna's bedroom via a long corridor, which also led to the garderobe, the bath chamber was a large hexagonal space, as ornate as any in the High Temple of Sigmar in Altdorf. The vaulted ceiling gave way to a towering space that reached to the heavens at a curious angle. Positioned on the interior of this tower were many mirrors, each tilted at such an angle that when the aperture at the very top of the tower was opened, light would be reflected between them, down and into the hexagonal chamber below. It was an ingenious design that ensured that even moonlight could be harnessed to illuminate the space. Directly below the opening to the tower lay a large stone-lined pool. It could take many hours of toil to heat and fill such a voluminous bath, so it was not often that the waters were drained and replaced. And, on a warm sunny day, the reflected light would be more than enough to raise the temperature to an acceptable level. About the walls of this chamber, sumptuous red tapestries dropped from rafters high above, their hems bundled atop one another on the floor. The bath was surrounded by something else as well, the pride of Maedna's mirror collection. Some were tall and freestanding, others wide and leaning against walls and colonnades. The assortment was diverse in style, with mirrors clearly hailing from across the old world and beyond. The craftsmanship of the elves was evident in a particularly elaborate and elegant cheval, whilst a wide, squat square bore the precise, intricate hallmarks of dwarfen skill. Bronze plate mirrors from Lustria, Cathayan silver mirrors, many examples of fire-gilded glass bearing the marks of makers in Albion, Altdorf, Zaragoza, and the countless lesser workshops besides. Centerpiece of this outrageous collection was a magnificent silver-backed mirror from the workshop of one of the finest Miraglianese glassworkers. It stood fully 7 feet tall, in close proximity to the bath, and it was immediately clear to any who beheld it just how rare it must be. The dyed mahogany frame was carved with complex interwoven patterns depicting a dance in celebration of Ulrich, and the glass itself was remarkably clear. Compared to any of these mirrors, the paddle was commonplace, boring even. Its ochre lacquer was perfectly smooth, but it held no decoration, nothing to draw the eye. As Maidner prepared to take his bath, he looked once again at the small mirror in his hand. The reflective surface bore a few more speckles of mirror rot, where moisture and rust had begun to penetrate the inner binding of the glass and backing. This was a typical defect in a looking glass, and many, if not most, made in the Empire would suffer from it eventually. Only those of the highest quality, the most assuredly expensive, would last any length of time, and given that those were all in the hands of noble families like his, it ought to be no surprise that a petty merchant would have a flawed example. And still, even with all of its defects, even amongst a collection of mirrors of excessive volume, variety, and beauty, Maidner found himself drawn to this small paddle. For many days it would stay with him at all times, resting on the nearest table or placed safely in the pockets of his robes. Occasionally he would find himself startled from a reverie by a sudden question or noise, unsure how long he had been idly staring into the surface of the mirror, not at his own reflection though, but at the mirror itself, as if it would reflect to him something he could not otherwise see in his real surroundings. Some days it seemed like the mirror was more damaged by rust than it had been previously, but it did not worry the Baron, for he was certain he could still see the truth in its reflection. Once or twice, he was sure he had seen a sign of the Yellow Knight, closer behind him and more ragged than before, his sword and armour bearing marks of battle, his cloak frayed and tired. Each time he thought he saw this figure, Maidner would place the mirror face down, before turning slowly to investigate what was going on behind his back. He became certain that this figment of imagination was merely a sign of boredom. The affairs of his baronry had become increasingly interminable, focused only on the lot of his people, and he was not surprised to find that he was subconsciously desirous of excitement. No doubt the presence of a malign knight would excite the senses. Some 2 weeks later, on a stormy evening with the snow resting heavily against the castle walls, Baron Maidner retired to his chambers early. The day had been an unsettling one. Reports of a great many deaths across his lands had been delivered in court. It seemed that starvation was rife, and many of those who had not starved were dying from cold. It was a situation that had no easy answers. If Maidner were to open the fortress stores and give grain and fuel freely to the people, then how would they be convinced to work again when the spring came? But if there were no people left alive to work the lands at all, then how would he collect taxes? The assembled nobles had talked at great length about the challenges and the options, and they had unanimously recommended a gift of supplies be given to each and every one of his people. But the Baron remained unconvinced, and had elected to take the evening to consider other options. He would not bathe this night, preferring to go straight to his warm bedchamber. At first he thought he might finally read Vendetto's treaty, but as soon as he lay down, his eyelids felt heavy, and he had fallen into a fitful slumber. Maidner awoke to total darkness. No lanterns were lit, and both of the bedroom hearths were cold. The Baron was furious at this turn of events, clearly the work of disgruntled servants who had overheard the discussions from court. It was an outrageous protest that would be punished most severely in the morning. The fact that an ungrateful fool would be separated from his head did little to warm Maidner in his cold bedroom though, and his first thought was to try and summon a servant to make up the fires. Of course, given that they had caused the problem in the first place, Maidner was not surprised that his calls went unanswered. Eventually, it became clear that he must relight the fires himself, and he left what remained of the warmth of his bed to try and find some firewood. However, there was no fuel to be found where it ought to be, and as he cast his eyes about the darkened room for anything he'd be happy to burn, Maidner thought he heard something behind the closed chamber door. There it was again, a crunching sound. Then there was another, almost like footsteps on sharp gravel. The sound seemed to be getting closer to the door. It was unlike Maidner to be afraid, but he could not help a shiver from running down his spine. He broke into a cold sweat, and felt his breathing becoming laboured, as if he had just run a mile in heavy armour, even though he had not moved from his position by the fireplace. He reached for a fire iron, but found that they too were not where they ought usually to be. Looking again to the room for any kind of weapon he might brandish, the closest object he could see was the paddle mirror, which he grabbed and held aloft as if it were a baton or a hammer. All the while, crunching footsteps fell closer and closer to the door. Maidner steeled himself for whatever it was that might be on the other side. He moved to the door to brace it and keep it closed, and there he waited, paddle mirror at the ready, for what felt like a lifetime. The noises stopped. Eventually, having caught his breath, Maidner decided that this was the height of foolishness. He had simply been out of sorts thanks to awaking suddenly in the frozen room. Slowly he turned the handle of the door, telling himself that the only thing he would find in the corridor was a sleeping guard or inept servant. Still, though, he kept the paddle mirror in hand, just in case. As the oak chamber door creaked open, it revealed an empty corridor, colder even than the bedroom. In the darkness, it was hard for Maidner to see, but after his eyes adjusted, he saw explanation for the sounds he had heard. All along the corridor was shattered glass and shards of mirror. A trail of bloodied footsteps traced their way from where he stood to the open door of the bathing room. As his eyes followed the red path, he saw a shadow in the doorway ahead, quickly darting into the room. Was it the merchant he had executed for her crimes? But that could not be. Despite the cutting glass that littered the corridor before him, Maidner marched straight to the bathroom. His temper had become inflamed. First, his servants had betrayed him, his guards had abandoned him, and now this petty merchant would taunt him in his own bedchambers. As he walked into the hexagonal room, he was confronted by a devastating sight. The glass that was strewn across the floor had come from his mirrors. Every single one stood shattered and destroyed. Even those in the tower had been torn from the walls and thrown to the floor. Maidner cried out in a rage. Who could have the temerity to do this? As he screamed into the darkness, he caught sight of his reflection in a shard of elven glass that clung to its frame, and he was frightened by what he saw. He looked at what was left of another mirror, and then another, and yet another. All agreed on his reflection. No longer did his beautiful blonde hair fall gracefully down his back. Instead, it had been cut brutishly from his head, savagely shorn in large clumps from his scalp. Blood ran down his face where jagged glass had sought to shave him, and worse, his own hands were covered in blood and cuts from grasping too tightly onto shards of mirrored glass. Maidner could not understand what he had done. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the blood and stinging his cuts. As he stood stupid and immobile, he heard again the footsteps. They crunched the glass, more slowly now, heavier and more deliberate. He could hear the sound of rusted metal and the scraping of steel blade on stone, but about him he could see no sign of where this noise came from. Every passing moment it got louder, closer. And then, Maidner remembered that there was still one unbroken mirror in the chamber. Slowly he lifted the ochre paddle to his face. Its surface bore many large spots of rust and decay, but Maidner was confident it still reflected the truth. Behind him, in the bathroom doorway, stood a hulking knight in rusted yellow armor.